Welcome to Learning Horizons, a series dedicated to reimagining learning, communicating, and collaborating in remote and hybrid workplace. What is possible? What could be done differently in the digital workplace to ignite creativity and performance? I'm Gail Watson, your host, and today we're going to discuss a topic that does not get enough attention: accountability in learning, and why it is an essential and often overlooked aspect of the process. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome today's guest, Paul Matthews, who is the CEO of People Alchemy, author of many books, and writer of the weekly Monday Tips, which has been a feature of my week for years. It's short, snappy, and thought-provoking. It's a great way to start the week, and I highly recommend to subscribe to it. Welcome, Paul, and thank you for taking the time to discuss accountability and its role in learning transfer.
Oh, wow. Thank you for the introduction. And thanks for reading my tips for so many years. I've been writing them for a long time now.
And they are very enjoyable. So maybe you would like maybe to tell us a little bit why you came to think about accountability as part of the learning transfer, what has been your journey around it, and maybe a little bit more about how you see accountability in the process of learning.
I think I didn't come into learning and development from learning and development. I didn't sort of start, my background's engineering, and I ended up getting involved with learning and development initially about 25 years ago, I guess, and as a trainer, and was very quickly realized that what I was doing in the training room was not really, having much impact beyond there. Now, that was a long time ago where you had a very big pile of overhead projector acetates and what have you. So, and I look back in horror at how things were done back then to a certain extent and my complicity in doing them that way. But anyway, I was working for another company as a sort of a temporary job, and so that's what happened. So move on, I started getting more into L&D, and that's when I started thinking more about, well, what happens beyond the classroom? What happens in terms of people doing something after they've been in the classroom? Because if they don't do anything after they leave the classroom, then there will be no change, no business impact. So that obviously brings up the question, well, who's accountable for that change and who's responsible for doing the actions that lead into the change? And responsibility and accountability are similar and correlated, but they're two actually different things, certainly in the English language. And so responsibility is very much about you're the owner of the action. It's your job to go and do that. It's your job to open the shop every morning at 8 o'clock. That's a job. However, the manager of that shop is the person who's accountable for making sure the shop is up and running for an 8 o'clock customer. So if someone who is responsible for doing a task doesn't do it, they may well get a serious reprimand. But it's their boss who is accountable for making sure that whole thing happened that maybe has to fall on their sword and resign and things like that. So there is that subtle difference between accountability and responsibility. So I think, and that's interesting as that plays out in the learning and development field, because then you can say, well, we want that delegate on that training course or doing that e-learning to go away afterwards and change, because otherwise, well, why are we doing it in the first place? So who's responsible for the actions required for the change to occur? And so that means you've got to start thinking about, well, what are all the actions that do have to occur for that person to change? And clearly the delegate is going to be one person who will need to be doing a number of actions over time. But chances are there are other actions that will be required from their line manager, from potentially subject matter experts, and potentially elsewhere as well. So there might be lots of people responsible for doing certain things, provided we've designed the program well, of course, and we know what those things are. But that's another part, is designing a workflow of activities for all concerned. So they need to be responsible for doing the activities, but then at an overview, who's accountable for holding all those people responsible? Now, That's the big question. And I think that's one reason often it fails in L&D is because there are so many people doing so many different things or that need to do so many different things in order to get change and impact that you end up without having anybody with this overview, higher level executive accountability for making it happen. You know, so that's, I mean, that might be the executive sponsor, but are they, I don't know.
Well,
I don't know if that answers your question or not, but
partly. So let's dig a little bit. So thank you very much. That's, I think, a very good way to start. I mean, thinking and shifted the thinking a little bit. So we realize that the outcome of the learning is the behavior change, right? But then the debate is, do we put all the emphasis of the behavior change onto the learner, which is what we've been doing for, I guess, since learning started over the age, that like the person who is receiving the learning take full ownership. But is that really realistic? Because we can only, I think, and you touch on it in one of your blog, which is the competence and the capabilities, is that if your ecosystem in which you evolve, you work doesn't equip you with all the tools you need to actually implement that change of behavior, then can you be fully responsible and accountable for that change? So who else come into play with the transformations? And so you said in this conversation that there are a range of people. Maybe it's interesting to actually think a little bit, brainstorm a little bit about who are the people. So we've got obviously the learner, we thought about it, the person delivering the learning experience, but who else do we think about that, have an influence on the responsibility and accountability of the learning?
well, the line manager is clearly one of the big factors in there, as are their peers and colleagues in their immediate surroundings. If someone is practicing and experimenting a new skill that they've been taught in a training room and they now need to start operationalizing it in their day-to-day workflow, chances are they're going to be slow at doing it or maybe make the odd mistake. So how do their peers and nearby colleagues help them through that period of getting to grips with it and getting it to the point where they can just do it without further thought? In other words, developing that unconscious competence. So there's the line manager, there's the immediate peers and colleagues. There might well be other people involved in the sense that doing things this new way requires maybe a new bit of software or a new tool or a new something that has to be supplied by somebody else. So they clearly have to be involved in terms of setting conditions up for that new way of doing things to be possible to do. The other big factor that surrounds someone when they are changing themselves in order to suit the desired new behaviors and things that are going on is the culture that they are swimming in. And of course, the culture, I mean, who's responsible for that? Ultimately, the CEO, not who's accountable for it, the CEO eventually. But in the more immediate area around them, who is responsible for doing things that will make the culture friendly to someone seeking to change their behavior into a new desired way of doing things? Because very often the culture is unfriendly to change. And so somebody's responsible for that, the changes that might be needed to get the culture shifting, and then ultimately who's accountable for that. So there's always going to be this chain of accountability that sits in place. If you think about, oh, I don't know, an orchestra doing, I think I used the example in one of my blogs, the conductor well, the musicians are individually responsible for playing their part in the orchestra. And at that point, the conductor is accountable for delivering a nice piece of music for the audience. And he's the one who will go and give a reprimand to each individual musician if they're not doing what they're responsible for doing. So the musicians at that point probably cannot be held accountable. It's the orchestra conductor who's accountable for the ensemble and the whole piece. But then who's he accountable to, or she? Maybe to the concert organizers. And who are they accountable to? Perhaps the paying customers. perhaps the metropolitan body that's putting the concert on. So there's always this chain of accountability, and I think that because of there's a certain complexity in that, and who's responsible, who's accountable. There's that RACI diagram, RACI diagram, which is well worth looking at in this view. We won't go into it here, but if people want to look it up online, RACI, that's a good way of looking at what needs to be done and who needs to be doing it, and who's responsible and who's accountable, and getting clear on that. So, yeah.
But thank you very much. That is very interesting. So we realize really the complexity of the environment we are in and we're dealing with. Interestingly, when you said, or when the learners will depend on the peers and colleagues, immediately the word that popped in was culture, because the way you give feedback or you tolerate mistake is absolutely part of the
exactly.
culture. So every single learning experience fits itself into a bigger framework of, how do we manage feedback? How do we progress? I'm curious, because it seems to be that we almost need to have all the star align. In fact, it's perfect night sky to be able to create that space. Do you have example, and maybe not necessarily naming, also welcome to, of organizations who do that well? So where do they start when they do that well?
Easy to talk about where they start. I think that's the right question.
Okay.
And the start point is, what do we want to come out of this training program or this L&D initiative, or whatever you want to call it? Let's just call it training for the moment, knowing that that covers, a multitude of different L&D initiatives. What do you want to come out the other end of that? In other words, in 6 months' time, what do we want to see that will prove to us that we were successful, that we got the change we wanted, whatever that change is? Typically, that change is going to be a behavioral change. It's what people are doing. And so then you can kind of work backwards from there, say, well, if we want these behaviors happening in 6 months' time, instead of the behaviors that are happening right now, you have a journey to take those people through. It's not going to happen overnight, which is why I say 6 months or 4 months or whatever. What is a reasonable period of time for that change to be possible for people, and for them to practice and experiment and think about it and reflect enough for them to get to the point where the way they do things in 6 months is just habitual now. It's the way we do things around here. So that's your first step, is thinking about what's the beginning point, what's the end point in terms of a behavior. And then you've got this behavioral gap, this chasm sometimes between where you start from, and then you have to scaffold that gap by adding a bunch of activities over time. So what are the activities those people need to be doing over a period of time to get from where they are now behaviorally to where you want them to be? And then it's a matter of stitching together those sort of step-by-step activities, turn-by-turn instructions, a bit like a sat-nav, to say, we need to hold people accountable / responsible for doing these things, because if they don't go and do them, they're not going to make the journey from point A to point B, and we're not going to get the results that we know we want. It really is that simple. And then it's a matter, implementing it maybe isn't so simple, depending on the culture and other things that are going on around about, but the concept of what you need to do is simple. And then you need some way of tracking whether people are doing what they need to do to make that journey. And if they're not, then obviously you can tap them on the shoulder and say, hang on a minute, we asked you to do these things. You're responsible for doing them. And the question is, who does the tapping on the shoulder? That'll be the person that's accountable for actually making those things happen. And here's an interesting thing about both responsibility and accountability. People have to accept them. You can't just assign them to someone.
Yes.
They have to be accepted as something they're willing to take on. So if you just say to someone, your responsibility is to, I used the example earlier, open up the shop at 8 o'clock every morning, you've got to give them what they need to be able to do that. And they have to say, yeah, I can do that. That's something within my remit, within my abilities. I can do that. Or they might say, well, no, I've got my school run at that time. There's no way I can do that on a regular basis. So you've got to allow people to not accept responsibility for some things if there's a reasonable reason for them not to do so. And then, of course, you can figure out with them, okay, there's some barriers to you doing what we want to make you responsible for doing. How can we operate together to collaborate to fix those barriers so you can do it? Or is there some other way we can set things up? And the same as with the accountability. If you go to the shop manager and say you're accountable for making sure the shop is up and running at 8 o'clock in the morning so customers can walk in, they have to say, yeah, I can do that. I have what I need to do that. Because if they don't think they have what they need, in either within themselves or with the surrounding support and so on, they will kind of, even if you say you're accountable, they'll take a back seat. They'll watch it fall apart and say, well, I told you so. So people have to accept accountability for doing something. And that's the other problem with L&D is very seldom is anybody identified to be accountable for a change coming out the other end of a program. And even if they are, no one kind of walks up to them and says, hey, you are accountable for the changes coming out of this program. If this program doesn't work and we don't get the changes we want, you are the one that's going to be put on the bonfire. Or, the people who are responsible for certain tasks might well get a reprimand, but ultimately you're the one who's signing up to say, we're spending this corporate money. It's my job to make sure it's spent well. And I am accountable for making sure that we get a result. That very seldom happens in an L&D program. And, it's really interesting. See, the L&D manager can't do that because L&D can be accountable for that behavior change, but not for the KPI increase. Yeah. There's no way L&D should ever hold themselves up as being accountable for changing KPIs, in my view, because there's too many other factors at play there. They do not have enough control over that. But what they can do is saying, we will work with you to the point where we will get, a behavior change.
That is fascinating in the way that it really shows that we need to shift totally the approach. What you described seems to be, I would say, we can already hear people screaming that it's way too time consuming for all the party involved. So it's already that you can feel like the buyer is time. But on the other hand, if we want to be able to demonstrate change, we need to make time for all the different tasks that you've described, particularly one that's interesting in the tracking. How do we track that change?
Yeah. Well, that's the question you asked earlier. Where do we start? And if you are starting by defining your endpoint, it's the Stephen Covey, start with the end in mind. Our end in mind is this set of behaviors. And the reason, how do we know those behaviors are now happening in our organization some months after we did the training? How do we know? What will we see, hear, or feel when those behaviors are being exhibited consistently and reliably by the people there that we were working with? So that's our evidence criteria. You see, that's your measures, is something that's directly observable. So you're either observing the behavior itself. In other words, you do a health and safety course on lifting, for example. I can now see the people are lifting the boxes in the warehouse the right way. All of them. That's great. 100% success rate. They're looking after their backs. They're lifting things well. They go and get a mechanical fork truck when it's heavier than what they should be lifting just on their own, and so on. So some behaviors are very observable directly. Others you will never see, like the way someone writes a report and the approach they take to it. They do that on their own at their desk. However, what you can see is the output from that behavior, which is the report. So you've got to say, what are we going to see in terms of direct observable behaviors in terms of change? In other words, you're looking at a Kirkpatrick level 3 eval here. What are they doing now? What do we want to see behaviorally instead? But don't just limit it to the directly observable behaviors, because some of the behaviors won't be. It will also, what are the first or second order effects of those behaviors, and how can we use those effects or outcomes in order to postulate that the behavior is now occurring?
So it's creating this space to look back at what's been achieved. And that's probably, when we're talking about mindset and ecosystem, that's probably a space where a lot struggle in L&D, that you move from one project to the next. And when it's being delivered, then that's it. The process starts there. And taking the time to track, to observe, it is time consuming, even if you manage, thanks to technology, to have a system in place to make sure that there is a certain amount of input. It's taking the time to reflect, as you say, to be accountable, to look at every piece is moving in the right directions. So I was wondering also, in your experience, so if you start well, what are the maybe 2 or 3 tasks that are absolutely essentials to make sure that there is a change delivered?
Start with the end in mind. So that's, lack of clarity of outcome is the root of all evil in L&D. It's a phrase I sometimes use. Once you have that, and then you are thinking, how do we deliver that outcome? Now, if that outcome is behaviorally defined, in effect, what you're saying is, how do we deliver those behaviors? And that's a very different question to what most L&D people ask, which is, how do we deliver this curriculum? And so you've got to start, and then you can say, if we're asking, how do we deliver this behavior? You've got to start saying, well, how do people change that behavior? How's someone else already done it? And you've got to then develop a set of step-by-step activities over time, some of which might well be sitting in a classroom. Maybe yes, maybe no, might be e-learning, but others will be practice sessions, experiment with this, talk with a colleague, discuss, collaborate, figure out how you can do this, look for the barriers in the system, and then figure out ways to get around those in order, that are in the way of this new behavior. So it's about developing that sequence of step-by-step actions that someone needs to take in order to get from where they are to where you want them to be. And then in some way, having some level of accountability for somebody who's going to oversee that process and make sure it happens. And again, that's a different conversation depending on the structure of the organization, how big the program is, whether it's just one team of 10 people or 20 teams of, 100 people, who knows? So clearly, the wider the span, the higher up the organization, that person who's accountable. And they need to be very aware they're accountable and agree to do it and say, right, okay, if this program crashes and burns, it's me that's got to fall on my sword, sort of thing. I'm being a bit dramatic there, but also, of course, that gives them an incentive to make it succeed. And that isn't just the trainer or L&D, of course, because all of those levers that need to be pulled to make learning transfer happen and the impact and results to be achieved. A lot of those levers, the trainer, L&D, whether they're internal or external, cannot pull them themselves. They are required from within the organization. So this is where there has to be an ongoing collaboration between L&D or an external company and the managers and other people involved with the process. It's a collaboration, and it will take time. You're quite right. But of course, if you don't put that time in, then you'll end up with a training course that has a 5, 10, 15% impact, and you're just wasting money. So you're better off doing a lot less training and doing it well than doing lots of training and not having it work very well.
Absolutely. So we need to start with to summarize what you've just said, we need to start with the end in mind. The best way to change behavior is to actually work around behaviors by looking at activities rather than looking at content and curriculum, and which is something I've been advocating for a while, and it's good to be reassured that we're going in the right direction. But there is one last question, because unfortunately we're running out of time already. We touched quite a bit on the managers of the learner. What is the level of responsibility, of accountability that can be placed on those people?
On the managers? I think quite a lot, personally. In every job description, there should be a line for anybody in a supervisory or management role: thou shalt develop thy people. It's like a commandment. And of course, so a manager should have that as part of their role, or even just a team supervisor, team leader. they should be, part of their role is to develop and grow their people. And of course, that's how they're going to meet their, you know, performance indicators and everything else. So because it's in their job description, they should be held accountable for doing that. Many of them don't bother doing any of that. Many of them don't even have one-to-ones on a regular basis. So I think it's really important. I think it's very important that you hold the manager accountable for someone developing and utilizing what they were taught in a training course. So yeah, so the delegate is responsible for doing a number of things, but of course the manager has to give them space to do that, and the manager has to be held to account if they don't take the time to do those things that we know need to be done. And then, of course, who holds that line manager accountable? Somebody more senior who has a bigger span of control and so on. But it's not L&D that can be there because that line manager does not report to L&D. They report into operations in some way. So yeah, as I said, it's not so. So that's why that RACI, that RACI diagram is useful because it will give you a way to start planning out on a diagram who's responsible and who's accountable for the different things that need to be done.
That is very insightful. We'll definitely put a link to the RACI diagram on the page below the recording, so that is great. Just I wanted to say that it is a process, isn't it? Creating this learning journey. There is a lot of moving part that needs to be accounted for. And I know you don't want to talk about your solutions but in general, in solutions, there are a lot of tools that actually now feed in the manager role. So the manager will receive notifications, will have a task. So the manager will be reminded. Then obviously it is responsibility to, do something with it. But we are now at a stage where it is possible to send notifications. So in various device, various format, whatever there is no excuses basically to say, oh, well, I didn't know, I didn't realize. So there are ways to really streamline the processes and prevent people from hiding behind the fact that they
Yeah.
didn't.
Well, see, too often there are no consequences if the delegates don't do anything.
Yes.
And there needs to be, because if there are no consequences, of course, motivation to do what needs to be done will be low. But also you've got to be careful with the line managers is, again, in order to make them accountable, they have to accept that accountability, which means they need to be given the tools and other bits, which is kind of what you were just talking about. And yes, there are digital programs. I mean, we have one at People Alchemy, a workflow program, which will do all the necessary nudging, provide the line managers with what they need to be effective at coaching and mentoring that person through the changes they're going through and so on. So that's all possible now in this digital world. Using workflow type approaches to L&D, and that's kind of one of the areas that we specialize in.
So really at the art of everything that can be achieved, I mean, there is a culture of the organization that needs to also create space for the learning, and that is pretty much the recipe for success. Otherwise, it's just learning is just a reactions to a problem that will be short-lived.
Yeah.
Anyway, we are running out of time. So, Paul, a huge thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing all the information, the resources. They are going to be findable here. I have a lot of questions. In learning, we all talk about other people learning. But sometimes it's good to take a moment to think, okay, where would I grow? Where is my passion? So maybe something outside of work. What would you learn, Paul, if you had more time, or if by the magic of learning technologies, the things you would like to learn all of a sudden become so much easier to learn? So what is the one thing that you've been postponing maybe?
So really, it's a fascinating question, that one. I think what I would need to learn is how to sit and do nothing. Actually, because I tend to not do that enough, I suspect, in my life. I do get a lot done as a result, but of course that's so I think that's one thing that would be very interesting is to be able to learn to chill out and do that.
Excellent.
But in terms of learning elsewhere, I'm intrigued with what AI is doing and going. And also I'm looking at AI with a view to how we might embed it within our, software product and stuff like that. So I'm intrigued with that whole field of where that's going. I'm fascinated as to what's going to happen with it. And playing with it a little bit, although I'm very new to the whole thing, I must admit. So.
Well, I think we all are when it comes to AI, even if, I mean, how old is ChatGPT now? Yet a year or 2 years? I don't know. I've lost track of time, but it's still new for everybody and what we can do and how we can do things. But that is definitely an exciting topic, and hopefully one that we will cover in a future Learning Horizons. You're welcome to join us at that moment. But Paul, a huge thank you. Really appreciate your time, your insight today. And thank you for everybody who's watching.
Great to be here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.